time in the future when Congress had a fundamental conflict of interest and or Congress failed to act on large known and growing problems, and therefore the states should have the ability to act if the Congress won't act. And as you know, Nick, a lot of Americans don't understand the states created the federal government, not the other way around. The states are sovereign entities. And in fact, when the Constitution was adopted, it was intended that the federal government would only do things that otherwise couldn't be done by the states or by the people. Back then, the federal government was only 2% of the economy. Before World War II, it was only 3%. Now it's 24% and growing rapidly, and we've lost control of our finances. So what the founders provided is that if 2/3 of the states, or 34, filed an application with the Congress for a so-called Article 5 convention, which would be a convention of states for the purpose of proposing one or more amendments. It's not a constitutional convention. It's a limited convention to propose one or more amendments. Then the Congress, and here's the key word, shall call the convention. Express, enumerated, non-discretionary, ministerial responsibility by the Congress. And my not-for-profit that I chair, the Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation, discovered over 3 years ago that there were enough active applications for a convention to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment in 1979, and the Congress never did anything. In fact, in 1979, there were 39 active applications, 30 for fiscal responsibility only, and 9 for plenary, meaning we want to get together to talk about one or more subjects. And for 25 years, from 1979 to 2004, the goal line had been passed, but the Congress didn't do anything. And the primary reason the Congress didn't do anything, and I'm giving the benefit of the doubt here, is they never set up a process for receiving, storing, and counting. And so I'll be kind to say they didn't know that the states had crossed the goal line. But in 2015, the House finally passed a rule that assigned the House Judiciary Committee the responsibility to receive, store, and count applications. The Senate still hasn't done anything. And at that time, they started receiving, storing, and counting in 2015, but they didn't have all the records. Their records were not complete. And so earlier this year, in January of this year, the House Judiciary Committee entered into an agreement with the National Federalism Commission, which is an official governmental, interstate, nonpartisan body that ends up representing the state's interest in connection with these kinds of matters. And the National Federalism Commission started with fiscal responsibility amendments, although they intended to look at all the applications. And the reason they started with fiscal responsibility was 2 reasons. One, arguably that's the most important. If we don't put our finances in order, frankly, the other ones won't matter. But secondly, fiscal responsibility was the only subject matter where assertions had been made by independent parties that the goal line had been crossed, and therefore the convention should have already been called. When they did their work, not only did they confirm the findings of the Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation with regard to 1979 forward, but they also determined that the goal line was crossed again in 2016 and 2017, and yet the Congress didn't do anything. And so last Wednesday, Constitution Day, the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Jody Arrington from Texas, Bruce Lee, executive director of the National Federalism Commission, and myself, as former Comptroller General of the United States and chairman of the Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation, released the report that confirms that Congress should have called the convention as far back as 1979 and as recently as 2017. And I called on the Congress to call the convention. Now we have to see what will happen. Right now, they're focused on just trying to fund the government for the next fiscal year. We'll have to see what happens. But if they don't act, I fully expect that one or more states' attorneys general will sue the Congress And this will be a matter that ultimately will have to go to the Supreme Court. The debt ceiling is a bad joke. It's failed to constrain the growth of government and mounting debt burdens. Statutory approaches to be able to provide fiscal discipline have not stood the test of time. The only thing that can bind current and future Congresses is a constitutional amendment. And it's important that we get one sooner rather than later and before we have a debt crisis that could result in a global depression. So those are the facts. That's bringing things up to date. And I hope and pray that Congress will finally do something, because I know that Congress is very good at doing nothing.
Yes, that would be good. And we've had several state attorney generals on our network before. One was Bob Ferguson, who was the state attorney general of the state of Washington. But he's also a chess player. That's sort of how we know him. And he's no longer the state attorney general. He is the governor of the state of Washington. So he's moved into a different political position. But I think it's very interesting that the state attorney generals are the ones that probably have to pick up the mantle and sue the U.S. government to go ahead and start the convention after almost 10 years?
No, 1979 was 46 years ago.
I know things move slow in Washington, but it's slower than building.
And let's talk a little bit about attorneys general and governors. You have to have standing in order to be able to sue. The only persons that have standing in this matter would be attorneys general. And there are 2 states where their legislatures have standing. I believe it's Arizona and South Carolina. Governors do not have standing.
Right.
And it's very similar to, the constitutional amendment process overall. It's between the Congress and the states. The president has no role. Now, obviously, the president can use the bully pulpit. Obviously, a governor can use a bully pulpit. Obviously, the president can encourage the Congress to do things or not do things. Obviously, the governor can encourage the attorney general to do things or not do things. In most states, attorneys general are elected separately. In some states, they're appointed by the governor. So obviously, they have more influence over who's in the job and what they do. What's also important is most attorneys general want to either be governor or they want to be senator, right? And so therefore, when they're making decisions, they're not just thinking about what's right, they're thinking about what's politically prudent. And therefore, you get situations where, how's this going to make me look from a political standpoint? Is this going to help me or hurt me in a primary or in a general election if I'm thinking about running for a different office? It's sad, but true. Both in Congress as well as in the states, we don't have enough people that have a solid backbone.
Yeah.
But we only need one.
Pardon?
We only need one.
That's true. You don't need a whole slew of them. You just need one state attorney general to pick it up. In the meantime, we're going to pick up our panel from Canada, Sasha Starr, who may know Bob Ferguson, who was a chess master. He actually was a Washington State chess champion several years, and he's been on our shows before, actually, with Elliot Neff, and he's now the governor of the state of Washington. Anyway, we'll bring also in Jatovi from North Carolina. Maybe he knows the state attorney general in North Carolina. I think Stein won that. We'll also bring in Sharif from Bangladesh, who the state attorney general there won't help us. Mark Lee, who's from North Carolina, the state attorney general there would help us. And in California, we have Rick Rosner. I don't know if Rick knows the state attorney general in California or not. He could be a help in this particular situation because
I'll look it up.
Because you do need the state attorney general to sue on behalf of the state to get them to call a convention that they agreed upon back in 1979. So
that's a long time ago. They should have done that sometime back. Hey,
Rob Bontas, but
I don't know. David, I have a quick question for you based on a conversation that I had, and I know we've talked about it before on this show, and it's an economical question. I was wondering if the convention would deal with this topic that I'm going to mention, because I had the pleasure of working with various musicians this past weekend at some street festivals and different events and everything. And one of them was from DC, and she was actually running a nonprofit that is going to. They attached an amendment to an item in Congress and everything, and the amendment is for a living wage for musicians. And I know we've got living wages for like fast food workers and other things that have been in the conversation about economics and everything like that. So I was wondering, in this whole notion of a constitutional convention, would that be something that would be addressed? Because I know that the artist, and she has her own nonprofit there in DC, is actually going to be performing, but she did say that they attached an amendment to try to get living wages for musicians, because we know a lot of times musicians are struggling, like a lot of artists and creatives are, and everything like that. So I just wondered, is that something that would be dealt with in a constitutional convention?
It would not be. It does not relate to the subject of federal fiscal responsibility, so that would not be a subject that would be part of the convention that we're asking for.
How would you stop? Like, there are more Republican states than Democratic states. How would you stop the Republican states from hijacking a constitutional convention and putting a bunch of nonsense in?
Well, that's a good question, Rick. I think it's important to understand that the primary objection to a constitutional a Article 5 convention, not a constitutional convention, Article 5 convention, is that it would run away. And there are several protections that we have that prevents that from happening. Number one, in 1979, which is the authoritative date, that's when it should have been called. There were 39 active applications. 30 of them were fiscal responsibility only, and 9 were plenary, meaning one or more subjects. When you have a convention under Article 5, it's one state, one vote, and a majority of the states rule. And therefore, a majority of the states will set the agenda. And since 30 out of 39 had fiscal responsibility only, that means that anything beyond fiscal responsibility would be ruled out of order. In addition, 16 states and counting have delegate loyalty legislation at the state level, which says that if a delegate to an Article 5 convention tries to stray from their charge, so in the case of the 30 states, trying to do something beyond fiscal responsibility, they can be subject to number one, immediate recall, but secondly, civil and in some cases criminal penalties for going beyond their charge. And the Supreme Court has already affirmed the ability of states to do that. And so even today, while we don't have 34 active applications today for a variety of reasons, and we can talk about it, a majority of the states still have fiscal responsibility only active applications. So even today, the scope of the convention can be limited just to that subject, because that's the number one argument against an Article 5 convention, that it will run away. It'll end up starting to deal with other issues. But keep in mind one thing: all the convention can do is to propose an amendment, and the ultimate safeguard, is 38 states that have to ratify anything they come up with. And the truth is 38 states aren't going to ratify something radical. It's just not going to happen.
Hey, David, just really quickly, on the same idea, along the same lines, would each state have its own agenda, even in terms of what they would consider fiscally responsible? Because I'm thinking even like Michigan used to be a car town and everything like that, or a car state and everything. So I'm imagining that a lot of their fiscal responsibility would be centered around the car industry, just like in Wyoming, it'd probably be centering around some of the farm industries and stuff like that. So I was wondering, how will you stop people from siloing what is fiscally responsible to them?
Well, I think it has to pass what I would call a straight face test. When you talk about fiscal responsibility, there are several ways that you can go about it based upon what's happened in this country and what's happened in other countries. 49 of 50 states have a balanced budget requirement in our Constitution. All right. The problem is that how do you define a balanced budget? A vast majority of these states define it as you balance cash flows. In other words, as long as the cash coming in equals to the cash going out, you've got a balanced budget. The problem with that is that, that uses cash accounting, and therefore you've got a lot of states that they say they balance their budget, but they're in terrible financial condition because they don't fund their pension plans, or they issue they issue bonds and use the cash out of that to balance their budget. You've got states like Connecticut, Illinois, New Jersey that are in terrible financial condition, primarily because they have huge unfunded, pension and retiree health care obligations that they play games with and say they've got a balanced budget, even though they're in poor and deteriorating financial condition. The traditional balanced budget like the states have doesn't make sense at the federal level. And so therefore you have to look and say, well, what are some other options? Well, you look to countries like Switzerland, you look to countries like Germany, you look to countries like Sweden, you look at the European Union, and you see that a lot of times they'll focus on debt as a percentage of the economy. How much debt do you have as a percentage of the economy, which is pro-growth, but it doesn't tell the Congress how to solve the numerator problem. How much of it is revenues? How much of it is spending? It just says you got to solve it. There are some people that want to end up having kind of, a balanced operating budget over a business cycle. I mean, there's different ways you can do it. But the reason I call it fiscal responsibility, it also gives you the ability to consider other things. It gives you the ability to consider things like, well, maybe we ought to have an investment budget and an operating budget. Maybe we ought to have no budget, no pay. You don't pass the appropriations bills on time, Congress doesn't get paid till they do. They have to stay in session, and there's no retroactive pay. As you know, the last time Congress passed all the appropriations bills on time was 1996, and they've only done it 4 times in my lifetime. And guess who the only people are that continue to get paid on time if we have a government shutdown? Congress. And they're the ones that cause the problem. So, the bottom line is, there are practical constraints as to what could be considered. It's got to somehow relate to federal fiscal policy and procedures, and extraneous subjects would be ruled out of order.
Yeah. David, do we have another practical problem in that the American public, because finance is something that's on a ledger sheet. This doesn't hit them in the face. This doesn't, how do you say it, take food away from them or take gas away from them or take their lifestyle. Because it's so amorphous, do we have a problem with the American public not being behind this because they can't see, feel, and touch it? Money is something that, unless it's cash in your pocket, you don't see, feel, and touch. And a debt on a balance sheet they can't see, feel, and touch. So you don't get any momentum in terms of getting people behind fiscal responsibility.
One of the critical things that we need to do, that I have done in 47 states plus DC and several other venues, is citizen education engagement that helps the public understand the facts, the truth about where we are, where we're headed, how we compare to others, what adverse things will happen if we don't change course, why we need to do it sooner rather than later, and what are some of the things that we need to do. Now, in doing that, I find that a vast majority of people can't relate to trillions, much less tens of trillions, much less 125 trillion. I also find out that they can't relate to, well, your share of the debt is $110,000. Okay. Well, they just don't relate to that. But let me tell you what I found that they do relate to. 2 things. One, if Uncle Sam was a person, what would his finances look like? And all I do in coming up with these numbers is I drop 8 zeros from the federal government's financial statements. In 2024, Uncle Sam would have made um, would have made $45,000. This is off the top of my head. Uncle Sam spent $70,000. So they have a 1 year deficit of $25,000. But Uncle Sam has total liabilities and unfunded obligations of $1,240,000. And therefore, Uncle Sam has a negative net worth of $1,183,000. Who's going to lend Uncle Sam money? Uncle Sam is big time bankrupt. Now, the United States is not an individual, and the United States has additional flexibility as long as people are willing to buy our debt. But we're already seeing signs of people losing their appetite for our debt, us having to pay higher interest rates in order to finance. The fastest growing expense is interest on the federal debt, for which we get nothing. Right now, it's number 2 to Social Security, but it's going to pass Social Security within the next several years if we don't change course. And people need to understand, all right, well, what does a debt crisis look like? A debt crisis is where people won't buy your debt at reasonable rates. It results in a significant decline in the stock market, much higher unemployment, deteriorating of our infrastructure, higher inflation, dramatic decline in the dollar, and a ripple effect that ultimately, in my view, would result in a global depression. And nobody's a winner in a global depression. So, you have to be able to convey things in terms that people can relate to. And in some ways, what you have to do is, as has been said, scare the bejesus out of them.
Well, speaking of scaring the bejesus out of them and everything like that, David, how often when you go on these tours and talking to people, do you make it very personal? Because I know that even on this network we've talked about, and I know Sasha has brought it up, that a lot of people can't find $5,000 or even some cases less than that when they are in financial crisis. And I would argue that quite a few people, maybe not so much the middle class, but definitely the lower middle class and those in poverty, are in a similar fiscal crisis to that of the American government. So I was just wondering, when you go to talk to people, how much do you kind of have them look at their own personal situation and tie it into the government situation?
I do. And the truth is, Mark, there are too many people that are following the bad example of the federal government with regard to their finances. And secondly, I'm a strong believer, as you know, that before individuals graduate from high school, they should have to pass a financial literacy and a civic responsibility class. I think one of the reasons that we're so dysfunctional, both from a civility and political standpoint, as well as from a financial standpoint, is because most Americans don't understand the basics with regard to finance. They also don't understand the basics with regard to what their responsibilities are in order to be an effective citizen in this republic. And I think both of those are contributing to our current dysfunctionality. Now, in interest, I want to mention something. Rick, just so you know, California has never had an application for a Article 5 convention for fiscal responsibility. With regard to Washington, they had a preliminary application which has been rescinded, but it was active in 79 and 2017. And with regard to North Carolina has had a single subject fiscal responsibility application for many, many years and still has one active today.
David, I've got to teach you, because you said that most Americans are making the example of the federal government, and I would agree with you, because most Americans use their parents, grandparents, and others that are more well off to serve as the role of the government and everything like that. So I'm sure they're elderly citizen and everything like that. And I'm just saying you're a little older than me and everything, but I'm not exactly a spring chicken. That we do know that a lot of times kids and even middle-aged folks will reach out to mom and dad to try to rescue them, and all along those lines, kind of like borrowing from the government model to you.
Well, the difference is parents and grandparents can't print money. Okay.
Right.
Let me give you a personal example. I believe that there are 17 states that currently require someone to pass a financial literacy course before they graduate from high school. I believe it's 17. It should be 50, okay, plus DC. The Commonwealth of Virginia is one of those, okay? And when my daughter was in junior high school, she had to take a class. And the first thing she had to do is she had to come up and do a budget. And back then, it was on paper. And they had a bunch of different line items. You know, what was your income going to be? And, you know, what are the typical kind of expenses you would have in order to be able to live? And so she was supposed to figure out what did she want to be and how much could she make in that, and, you know, and engage with her parents about, you know, what does it cost for rent? What does it cost for gas? What does it cost for insurance, et cetera? So she was doing this and asking us questions. And when she got done, she thought she had a surplus. And I said, well, that's great, but let me ask you a few questions. First, what did you budget for taxes? They didn't even have it on the sheet. They were having them planned based upon gross income rather than net income. The next question I asked is, what did you budget for savings? Savings? What's that? It wasn't on the sheet. The next thing that I asked was, what did you budget for charitable contributions? It wasn't even on the sheet. So once I ended up educating her a little bit about that, she put in the taxes. She all of a sudden was underwater.
Right.
Needless to say, when you're underwater, you don't have much for savings and charitable contributions. I mean, these are the basics.
Right.
The basics.
You know, I think what should happen is it should not be a class. It should be a 4-year program. And I'll tell you why. There's actually a really good 4-year program out there right now. It's the College for Financial Planning. It actually is really, really good. And it would take about 4 years to go through the course. One is on investments, and you have to learn investments, and it's pretty rigorous. The other course is on taxes. And if you're a high income taxpayer, I can promise you your number one budget item is taxes if you have high income.
Yeah.
Number two is everything else, but number one, taxes. So they do investments, they do taxes, they do general financial planning, they do retirement planning. It's a whole structured course, which literally could take you 4 years to work through. And then somebody, when they graduate, would have a basic foundation to survive in a very rigorous financial economy. Rather than just one course, I think they should be forced to go through it. It's more valuable than algebra. I'm sorry. I took algebra, I took calculus, I took analytic geometry. They're all wonderful courses, but nothing is more important than basic financial planning. It just doesn't exist.
Well,
All the other courses, flush them down the toilet. They're fun, but no, financial planning is number one. Yeah, Jacoby.
the real question is, how many hours does it take, right? And, then you can say over what period of time is it reasonable to be able to get it done. Jacoby, I think you've had your hand up.
Yeah.
Speaking for the poor people in the world, because I'm not on I'm on the Spain trip and I'm on this trip. I think we're missing a lot. We're speaking from a plateau that most people aren't. When we're talking about, for example, the financial literacy courses focusing on investments, that's something that somebody who is making, barely making ends meet, working 4 jobs, trying to pay for school, trying to pay for food and this and that and the other thing for their kids, isn't really thinking about investments and don't really have the time to invest 4 years into something like that. Even if you're coming up in a single parent home, trying to help out your parent or your mother or your father, take care of your sister or your brother, you're not focused. You don't have the extra time to spend on for a 4-year course that you're speaking about. How do we dumb it down or make it simpler for not only people to understand the financial literacy piece, but also one of the biggest problems that we have is opportunities for individuals. The reason why teachers are working 3-4 jobs is because you're not paying the teachers as much. The reason why many individuals are, the average, I think, income in the U.S. is sitting close to under 60,000 is because there are a lot of individuals that are missing out on opportunities, and they don't have that. And now we're throwing in the problems around technology and the problems where AI is taking these jobs and stuff like that. Where does the not only the financial literacy piece that's very small that can be digested by somebody who doesn't have the time, but also the opportunity for the individual that also does not have that time? Because I think we're speaking from a plateau that doesn't help as much as we could.
Well, I started, Jatovi, with the most basic things you need to start with. It's called a budget. All right. And you'd be amazed how much people can learn when you just go through that basic exercise of creating a budget. I'm in a situation in life now that I don't have to have a tight budget. Okay. When I worked for the government, I sure as hell did. The first time I came in to the government, I took a 75% pay cut. The second time I came into the government, I took an 85% pay cut. I can assure you that I needed to have a budget, okay? Because I didn't want my families to be adversely affected by it, but I had to be a lot tighter, if you will. I still do some planning, okay? With regard to, cash flows and with regard to taxes and things of that nature. But I have one thing, I don't have one thing that vast majority of Americans have. I have zero debt intentionally. And I've had zero debt for a long time. I don't have any credit card debt. I don't have any mortgage. I don't have any car debt. It took a lot of discipline in order to get in that situation. And people really need to try to be in that situation by the time that they retire. But again, so I agree with you that you have to start with the fundamentals. All right. You have to start with the fundamentals. And then maybe over time you can get more sophisticated, with regard to investments and tax planning and things of that nature. But, let's talk about the budget again. The Congress still doesn't have, a real budget and all the appropriations bill. They still don't. So if the country doesn't, how does an individual understand that it's bad not to have one, right?
Well, also, my argument is the College for Financial Planning program should be in high school, because I know what Jatovi's talking about. After you graduate from high school, life takes over. In other words, you're too busy trying to make ends meet. But in high school, as your wasted 4 years, is the time when you want to interject the financial planning program, so that they go 4 years and learn it. It'll be the most important things they'll ever learn, because algebra is like a fun. I was good at all the math classes, and biology and chemistry. I mean, all that's interesting. Well, this is the most important part of your life.
I think, honestly, I think Dave gave me the answer that I wanted to focus more on. Nick, I think you're speaking again from a plateau that people really aren't at. Because when you're saying after college, life takes over, no, life is taking over once you are born.
True. But what are you going to learn in high school that's more important than basic financial planning?
Nick, hold on. Wait.
That's not coding, Jatovi.
I'm speaking from a different plateau than where you're speaking at. You're coming from a position of royalty where you've had a lot of money and you've been used to that. A lot of people, for example, the reason why a lot of these athletes end up going broke, for example, they did a study on it. 70 to 80% of the actual athletes that make all this tons of money end up flat broke. Why? It's not because, hey, they didn't know about investment and all this, that, and the other thing. No, they ended up blindly trusting a lawyer that ended up taking all their money. Not only that, they were given all this money at the age of 15 and didn't understand about it. That has nothing to do with investment or anything. What I'm speaking of is that we need to, and I think Dave hits on the simple thing of learning how to budget. And that is where I think the financial literacy piece can fit into high schools. And then if people want to go in more into things, because a lot of people don't find the financial side interesting. But if they can learn the simple piece of budgeting and then figure out, okay, there are other opportunities outside or that you can add on to, that's a way to get it into high schools and everything else. But if you're going to talk about, hey, you got to take this 4 years, and now I'm going to get out of learning biology, which is something that I really enjoy, learning biology, that's really going to take away from people looking for the other piece, the opportunity. Because financial literacy is one thing. You can be as smart as you want for money, but if you ain't making nothing, and if you don't have the opportunity to make anything, you're still screwed. So I think the budgeting piece that Dave talked about.
Yeah, that's a different issue. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, Jatovi, we're not top 25 in the world in education outcomes in K through 12. And if you don't get a solid education, and if you're not competitive, you're not going to have as much opportunity. So one of the things that we got to do is fix the education system overall.
Yep.
It's much more than financial literacy, believe me.
I completely agree with that.
It's much more than financial literacy, and like even Nick likes to say, it's also people that are willing to sacrifice their budget because they have something that they want to see, whether that's an entertainer, whether that's an athlete, or whether that's a whatever, because we do know that some of those prices are astronomical, and then it's got to be that is it worth it to go see Hamilton if Hamilton is costing a lot and is going to actually exceed your budget? Because I think a lot of people make sacrifices for their budget, knowing that they're making that sacrifice because they wanted to see Beyonce forever, and Beyonce tickets aren't cheap and everything like that. So what do you say to the folks that are making those budgetary sacrifices on their own kind of like rule of what they want to do? Because we do have a society that's very quick gratification, and sometimes people want to make that sacrifice because they, like I said, always wanted to see Beyonce or Jay-Z or whoever else is popular out there, Shakira.
Let me give you an example of starting early. It's something I did right before this show. Mm-hmm. Some of you may know that I'm a member of Rotary International, which is the largest professional and business organization in the world, in most countries around the world.
Yeah.
And one of the things that our Rotary Club does is we end up giving books to elementary schools, and we also have a reading program, for elementary school. And I got assigned this morning to pre-K, and so I had to read them a book, and the book that I read them was about George Washington. Okay, so I wore my George Washington general's hat. I had my George Washington bobblehead thing that everybody loved. They loved the hat, whatever. But I did talk to them about money. Mm-hmm. And I told them, I said, here's George Washington on the $1 bill. I said, how many of you, how many of you get an allowance? And do you have to work for the allowance? And, just basically talk to them about some very, very simple things. Okay. But one of the things that I found, which is shocking, is you wouldn't believe how many people think that if they've got checks, they've got money. You wouldn't believe how many people think that all you got to do is go to the wall and put in a debit card and you can get money. You wouldn't believe how many people who end up buying basic things, even things like coffee or whatever else, with a credit card. And if they don't end up paying the bill off every month, they end up paying multiple times what the darn thing cost because of the interest cost on it. So, it is a building block approach. I mean, I do believe that you have to start not at pre-K. Believe me, I just did that kind of for fun this morning. But you have to start before they're out of high school, and you have to have a building block approach. Another example is when you get a job, and nowadays, most employers have 401k retirement plans, savings plans, right? I mean, one of the things you tell people is you want at a minimum to save what the employer match is, because if you don't save what the employer match is, you're turning down a raise. You're turning away money. Okay. So you have to be able to put it in fairly simplistic terms, I think, for it to resonate. And it is a building block approach over time, in my opinion.
Hey, David, along those same kind of lines, do you think that we teach enough about, you kind of alluded to when you were talking about your daughter and what you did with her budget when she had that budget assignment and everything. But I don't think that we teach enough to our kids or in general, and definitely not in the school system, about these lovely things called service fees. A lot of people love going
That's right.
to
That's right.
DoorDash and going out to other things, but they don't necessarily know that they're going to pay these service fees that, as you just said earlier, could be even the cost of the item that they wanted. But I don't even think that our economic courses talk about the service fees. You don't find out about them until you become an adult and get hit by them and everything. So I just wanted to.
Well, and another example is you write checks. The bank clears the biggest check first.
Yes.
All right. And therefore you can have small checks that the big one bounces and a bunch of small ones bounce. Whereas if they cleared the smallest one first, you might only have one bounce. And then how much is the cost per check? Like $35 or something like that, no matter what the size of the check is. Okay. Those are basic things that people need to understand, and for the most part aren't taught.
Here's a question though, as a potential solution, because we keep seeing, right now saying it needs to be in high school, it needs to be in this, it needs to be in that. Well, it needs to be in high school or it needs to be in college, but we're forgetting about where our money is. Would it be a better solution? Because once you open a bank account, they don't do anything. They just take your money. Why not have that option as a financial literacy class for every bank to offer? Before you can actually open a bank account, you have to take this class, or you have to take this budgeting class, because then that would put the onus on the banks, because right now the banks are the ones that are actually jacking up the fees on overdrafts and so on and so forth, which is where they make a ton of money. Why not have that extra money spent there, or put that the onus on the banks to actually pitch in and help out on this problem that we're having?
Well,
That would be a good idea, actually, Jacoby. And in retirement planning, there's a section 44C that if you have a retirement plan, the employer is supposed to provide you investment education. The problem in reality, they don't. Okay, so they just violate it all the time. It would be a good idea if the banks did, where there was a requirement that they did teach them what you're describing, so the banks don't rip up people off with all these crazy fees. I did check the PISA scores. This is the Program of International Student Assessment. The U.S. ranks 34th in math of like 150 countries. Science, we're 16, better off than I thought, and reading it's number 9. So the U.S. isn't extremely horrible, except oddly enough in math. We're very math challenged. And if you look at financial planning, most of it is math. I mean, basically it's simple math. So it doesn't surprise me that we see U.S. having very bad scores in math. I was struck odd to see how good we are in reading and science. So it's we're not so bad in that.
Maybe it's just because it's English.
Yeah, it could be. I don't know, but this is what this was done in 2022, and they don't have 2025 results. So I'm just
Professor Nick, I want to add some points on economic education system. My 15 years of time, I work with the Western world, and definitely I work in emerging economy. Right now, I'm in Bangladesh, you know. This is my observations in terms of STM educations. Number one, if you see the South Asian, Indian continent, subcontinent educational system, in 100 years, how we develop the math learning culture, physics learning culture, economics learning culture, you can find naturally our people is very capable in STM, especially the mathematics. It's not education system. USA has better education system or infrastructure, but this is culture. Secondly, when you discuss about economics, this is the things I find many of my friends, they do not have enough understanding about emerging economy. And that is the impact we are observing in tariff, we are observing in all of the US decisions. And always Honorable David Walker said about long-term policy. Like, this is my understanding, even though the US policymaker, they do not have enough understanding about emerging economy, how Bangladesh grassroots level economy run, how USA can get benefits or make business collaboration with that. You can see even China, last 7-8 years, they can understand, they can predict that USA gonna expose or impose tariff war with China. So they took 4 decisions. Number one, China export have growth recently for more than 2 decades. And why their export growth? Because they heavily invest in emerging economy. So China is the largest investor in emerging economy, like ASEAN country, like Bangladesh, like Pakistan, like India, like Malaysia. If you see USA, they don't have any positions, like in 3rd and 4th position in emerging economy. Third, geographical profile, China export has changed since term this Trump first term comes. So, and they also heavily invest in R&D, what you were discussing about education. So my thoughts about present US discussions, their economic policy, their all of the tariff and everything, they have very limited understanding about emerging economy. Very limited, very limited. I think I can offer, like, for learning purpose, I go to Stanford. Definitely, I go to Oxford and Cambridge for learning purpose, and many of our students goes. If USA focus on long-term educational development in terms of economics, emerging economy, I say emerging economy is virgin compared to the developed nation like China, like example like Japan, like European Union, like USA or Canada. All of them has a lot of depth. So for that particular issues, if they send their young generations, let's say for learning microfinance in Bangladesh, they will be benefited through this process. The major understanding, USA has very weak economic strategy. Right now, they are suffering for that particular issue, and China has better strategy. So anyway, maybe it has debate, but this is my concern.
Well, Doctor, let me come back. You know, the United States has been a republic since 1789. And we still don't have a comprehensive, outcome-based, future-focused strategic plan. China has not been, a country nearly as long as we have, and they have one. And the Belt and Road Initiative is a subset of a much longer range, much more comprehensive, and much more outcome-focused strategic plan that is focused on economic, diplomatic, military, and cultural dimensions. We don't have that. And that is a huge omission. It's something that I have been advocating for and am trying to get private sector funding to be able to come up with the first framework that we would have in that regard that would be outcome oriented, because the U.S. tends to focus on inputs and outputs and not outcomes. It tends to take for granted, the fact that we're the largest economy, that we have the strongest military. Yeah, but as we just found out with regard to education, we're not top 25 in the world with regard to some things. I mean, we've got problems in a number of areas. And so, you need to have a plan. We need to develop one. China is much more aggressive in not only planning, but execution in certain parts of the world, in particular, Lower Asia and Africa and even South America. They're much more aggressive than we are. And that's got to change if we want our future to be better than our past.
I just wanted to say hi to David Walker. I got here a little late. It's always a pleasure to see you. I didn't get to get much in. A lot to talk about, but we'll catch up next week. I just wanted a lot going on in the world, David. Down here, they're talking about the H-1B, the fees of $100,000. A lot of news media outlets are calling me about that. U.S.-India relationship, just total disruption. It's crazy times out here. So anyway, in the world.
Yeah, as the Chinese say, interesting times. But anyway, I'll see you next.
Yeah, I'll see you next week, and things are going good on the campaign trail. I think we might pull this one out.
Glad to hear that. Glad to hear that.
Thank you.
And overall in the education system, the U.S. was ranked by U.S. News and World Report to be 34th.
That's more like what I.
Well, see, PISA has their own study. There's several of them that do studies. So PISA's report came out in 2022, and U.S. News World Report comes out all the time, and they have a ranking where U.S. ranks number 34th in education. Number 1 is Singapore, oddly enough, but that's a small city state, so it wouldn't surprise me. They don't have a big population. But with that, we'd like to thank our viewers in the United States and around the world. And of course, the Honorable David M. Walker, who is pushing for fiscal responsibility in the United States, which I think is a hard push because we're management by crisis and emotion as opposed to hardcore numbers, but it does affect everybody's life. So I want to thank you for that. And we'll see you next week on Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. Take care. Bye-bye.